The co-presenters are Alexa Leestead and David Metler. So Alexa is our program research specialist. Alexa's been with us since 2015, and Alexa is the person responsible for helping me to set my priorities weekly. So I'm very, very thankful for the facilitation that Alexa provides. And then David, we couldn't do the work that we do in southern Minnesota without your support. So your research is excellent, and we all are very, very grateful for what you do for us. So thank you very much for that. Okay, I'm going to talk about 4 things during my talk. As Todd mentioned, I'm going to start by talking about soil residual herbicides and visit with you about their performance in a dry season. But then I'm also going to talk about Waterhemp escapes and some of the options that we have, including Ultra Blazer for controlling escaped pigweed. Number 3, I think we're going to have a higher than normal likelihood for volunteer corn in 2022. So I have a few remarks about that. And then finally, a Palmer Amaranth update. So before I start, I spend a lot of time looking at the old records of work from the Sugarbeet Research and Education Board. So these records are available online at www.sbreb.org. So if you're ever interested in referencing the old research, go to our website. But what I found is, you know, our concerns with pigweed are not something new. I went all the way back to 1975, and it's interesting to me that 39 times out of 45 surveys, pigweed species have been voted our most troublesome weed in sugar beet. So today we talk a lot about water hemp, as we should, but if we go back to 1975, we spent a lot of time visiting about red root pigweed. So Mark has already alluded to the rainfall, to the weather data that we had. I'm going to go back to 2020 and indicate that it was dry in April and May in 2020. And then in 2021, in addition to being dry in April, it was also dry in May and June. And that weather certainly impacted the performance of soil residual herbicides. So I'm going to start by visiting about Ethofumesate. So I use the common name. The trade name is Nortron, it's Ethotron, it's Ethofumesate 4SC, and it's Nectron. So we have lots of different options for Ethofumesate depending on where you buy your product. And I evaluated an experiment that I thought was an absolute disaster at our Fargo location. But if you look at the picture on the right, there's a treatment effect there. So we did a much better job of controlling the earlier, larger water hemp in this plot than what occurred later on. So I went back to the beginning and I started to take notes on the big water hemp as compared to the little water hemp. So that's what's in this picture here, or what's in this table. So you can see the rate is on the left, rates from 2 pints all the way to 12 pints. And the table here is control from an incorporated application as compared to a pre-emergence application. And I evaluated, as I mentioned, the early germinating as compared to the late germinating water hemp. So the data is in the table. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit, and what we have in this figure here is the same information that was in the table. So let's try to dissect this and to figure out what happened in this experiment. And to be honest with you, this mirrors some of the observations that we've seen in previous years. So first of all, a little bit about herbicides and how they respond in soils. So first of all, we need to target them to the right place. Our weeds are germinating in the upper 1 inch. That's where we need to get our herbicide, okay? We like to talk about getting our herbicides incorporated, and we sometimes think just because we get rain to incorporate that we don't have to worry about them any longer, and that's not true. Herbicides need to be in the soil solution. So they need to be in the soil solution to be taken up by seeds or by the shoots and roots as weeds start to develop. And there's a metric that describes this affinity for soil residual herbicides to either attach to soil or to be in the soil solution. And that's what's called the KOC value, or the absorptivity of the herbicide. So on the table here, we have 3 different herbicides. We have Ethofumesate, and we're going to compare that to Outlook and to acetochlor, or to Warrant herbicide. So you can see that Ethofumesate has the highest number, and Outlook has the lowest number, which means that Ethofumesate loves to be bound. If it can, it would prefer to be bound to soil than it would be to be in the soil solution. And you can see that water solubility very closely matches or aligns with the KOC values. So an herbicide that wants to be bound to soil has a low water solubility score. And likewise, you can see Outlook is much more water soluble as compared to Ethofumesate, and Warrant is somewhere in between. So this picture describes the same thing that I just mentioned. In green is a perfect situation where our herbicide is in the water solution and it's available so that seedlings, shoots, or roots can take up the product. Now, when it's very dry, it's going to be bound to soil. And as you can see in the picture, it's not going to be available for uptake by seeds or seedlings. But the good news is that when we do get rain events, our herbicide can move from the soil colloid back into the water solution. And that's what's occurring in the final picture. And I want to reinforce that just because the herbicide was in the water solution in the beginning, it sometimes moves back to soil. And if it's attached to soil, then it's not in the soil solution and it's not going to be providing weed control for us. So back to the experiment that I started with, I believe what happened, and I want to start with the PPI application. I believe that we moved the herbicide into the soil, but it was tightly bound to soil. So it was unavailable for uptake by Waterhemp in response to those rain events. Now let's go to the pre-application. We did get some soil and we did get some rain in late May, so we did have partial activation of herbicide. And I think that partial activation does explain why we had some early season weed control from Ethofumesate. Jumping back to PPI application and on some of the late weeds, once we got the rain events in June, the herbicide moved back into soil solution and it provided pretty good weed control for us. Whereas in the case of the pre-application, I think a lot of that surface applied product probably was lost due to degradation. And I'm going to have more to say about that as I summarize our soil residual herbicide experiments. Now, I shared this cartoon with you a year ago, and I'll be honest with you, I feel like I have a much better understanding of how Ethofumesate controls weeds, especially at different rates, based on some of the data that we saw in 2021. So I want to go back to the 2020 experiment and try to explain what I think might have occurred. So the different colors here, the different lines are corresponding to different Ethofumesate rates. And last year I made the comment, is etho at 1.5 pints or 3 pints, is it doing anything for us? And I made the comment, is full control for less time, or is Waterhemp control just less than full control from the beginning all the way through? And I think what we can do is we can think about how dry it was again in 2020. And I believe we lost some of our Ethofumesate, and even though we eventually got it incorporated into the soil, especially at the lower rates, we didn't get the control because we lost that product that we applied. No, I'm not satisfied with these higher rates either, but we did get that product eventually incorporated into the soil, and it provided some weed control here. If 85% is the threshold, we got anywhere from 40 days all the way up to close to 60% control based on the applications. So I want to talk about a second experiment. And this experiment was a combination of pre-applied products and post-applied. And the design that we used was called a factorial experiment. So factor A was the pre-herbicide application, and there were multiple levels of pre. And the second factor was the post-emergence application. So the experiment is to make every factor A application and every factor B application. So in the 2021 experiment, there were 3 factor A treatments and 4 factor B treatments, or a total of 12 treatments that I'll visit about today that were in the experiment. So I want to start by talking about factor A, and that was the pre-treatments. And the arrow here, it just tells us that we had rainfall to activate the pre-treatments. And you can see 3 treatments here. No pre-treatment using a combination of etho and dual pre, or using Ethofumesate at a higher rate pre. So I want to, and this is the first time now that I've mentioned the etho dual treatment here. And I want to say that I really like this treatment. I think it's the best of both worlds. So you have one herbicide that's easier to activate, and then the second herbicide that provides longer, more residual control than the first herbicide. And that's what the etho dual magnum treatment is, applied at 2 pints plus 8 pints. Now, when we get up to 6 pints, we can accomplish some of the same things. But for some of you, 6 pints is way too much for your cover crops. So what we learned from the experiment, and it's again looking only at factor A, and then averaging all of the factor B treatments within those treatments, what we're seeing is the pre-treatments, even in a dry season at Blomkest, is providing better weed control for us than not having any pre-treatment at all. So the differences aren't great, but we're seeing that advantage to pre all the way through the season. And I want to state it again, in a dry season. Now let's look at the post-treatments. And again, now all of the pre-treatments are averaged over these post-treatments. And there's there's 4 treatments I want to look at. I want to look at glyphosate, and that's glyphosate followed by glyphosate. And then we also included, in addition to glyphosate, we added Outlook, and then we made a split application. So Outlook at 2 application timings, the V2 stage and the V6 to V8 stage. The 3rd treatment was Warrant, and then the 4th treatment is a combination of Outlook and Warrant. Now, the arrow for rainfall is much later in the season here, okay? So we're looking early on at performance of these treatments in a pretty dry year. So how did the treatments do? So the treatment that's numerically the greatest and is statistically different is the Outlook treatment. And this makes a lot of sense to me, and it gets back to the chemistry part. Outlook is easier to get activated into soil, and especially when it's dry, we would expect to see better control, and that's exactly what we got. But you can see here that our chlorocetamide herbicides are all performing better, at least numerically, than the glyphosate-only treatments. You can see the data at 31 days. Again, we're seeing the advantage of the soil residual herbicides. And then once it rained, we really see the advantage, because as soon as it rains, we get a flush of weeds that are occurring. And of course, then glyphosate only isn't going to be of as great a value for us. So at the end of the season, all 3 of our treatments provided near identical control, but the means by which they got to good control differed depending on what the herbicide treatment is. And I always tell you that you decide what chlorocetamide herbicide you want to use based on what your risk factors are. So I want to summarize this part of the presentation, the part that has to do with soil residual herbicides, especially used in a dry season. So bullet number 1, I stand by our strategy. The use of our soil residual herbicides is the best strategy we have right now for controlling water hemp and sugar beets. Number 2, stick to the program and stick to the application timings. Don't try to time to rainfall, because just like investing money, we're going to miss the right time. So when we say pre-application, when we say application at the 2-leaf stage or 6-leaf stage, please stick to those application timings. Number 3, and this really gets to if you intend to incorporate your herbicide, keep it shallow. You're not doing tillage, you're incorporating a herbicide into the soil. And as I mentioned earlier, that means getting the herbicide into the surface 1 inch. For water hemp control, having etho down 3 inches isn't going to do any good at all. All it's going to do is dilute our product. So keep it shallow. That tillage event is to get the herbicide incorporated, and it's not for the tillage or preparing seedbed. Number 4, if we go into the data, there is some published literature that indicates that ethofumesate, especially in very, very dry conditions, is tightly bound to soil. And it also degrades more rapidly. And etho is still a very valuable herbicide for us, but I think this literature probably helps us to understand some of the observations that we've seen in very, very dry conditions, where our product isn't working as good as what we thought it would do. And again, that's the beauty of the program. That's why we like to use these other products in sequence with what we use pre-emergence. Okay, so there are going to be situations where we have escapes. Cody's already talked about this. I'm not going to belabor that. What the table here indicates is our various strategies for controlling escaped weeds. And these are a combination of special labels, either the section 18 that we're using for Ultra Blazer or the 24C that we're using with the hooded sprayer. So we had an experiment that worked out really, really well at our Blomkest location. And what we tried to do in this experiment was to create escaped weeds, or water hemp that volunteered or passed through the program, and I'm going to call those escaped weeds. So that's what we're going to talk about, is what can we do to control those escaped weeds. So the experiment had 6 treatments. So the first one was ethyl broadcast at a high rate, and then it was followed by glyphosate. And then after that are 5 treatments that were really designed to create volunteers. And the 30-day after planting evaluation demonstrated that we did get water hemp escapes. And you can see about 80%, and all of our treatments had about the same level of escaped. So what we did was we put on some treatments. And you can read the 4 treatments that we use. We either use Liberty or Gramoxone using the hooded sprayer. Or the 3rd treatment was to cultivate. And then finally, the 4th treatment was our Ultra Blazer, and in this case, with PowerMax application. So as it turned out, I visited the experiment 2 days after the treatments were applied. And you can see that some of these treatments had a very, very fast speed of control. So the Gramoxone, as you would expect, it worked immediately. And it provided us with 90% control. And as you'd also expect, cultivation was immediate. And it also had the greatest level of control. So I came back at 24 days and I took evaluations. The data is in the table here. And the point I want to make here is all of these treatments provided the same level of control for us. So my message to you is you decide. Decide if you want to use Blazer, decide if you want to use the hooded sprayer, decide if you want to use cultivation. I didn't talk about the weed zapper, but that's another way to control weed escapes. But the advantage of using one of these techniques is going to provide a yield benefit for us. And what I'm trying for you to do is to appreciate what these various approaches offer. And I want to encourage you to implement them as you control escaped weeds in fields. Now, I want to talk for a few minutes about volunteer corn. And it was dry last year, which means we have stock quality challenges, and then we had wind events. And I'm going to forecast that we're going to have a lot of volunteers in 2022 in Southern Minn. So I was fortunate to see some work that Kyle Gustafson from Winfield United posted on social media. And Kyle made several very, very important points that I'd like to reiterate with you as you look at managing some volunteer corn potentially that you might have in 2022. So the first one that Kyle mentioned is if you're going to use one of the group 1 herbicides, and we're calling out clethodim here, and it's sold under a number of different names. Winfield United calls it Section 3. It's also called Select Max. But if you're going to use one of the Cyta Action 1 products, you need to combine it with an adjuvant. The adjuvant combined with the Site of Action 1 herbicides is what gives us the good volunteer corn control that we're after. So please incorporate one of the adjuvants to maximize performance. Number 2, be careful about combining a group 1 herbicide with a group 4 herbicide. And there's two different kinds of examples here. One of them is clethodim with dicamba, and the other one is clethodim plus 2,4-D. And what you're seeing in these pictures here is antagonism, okay? And others have reported the same thing. The group 1 herbicide is not providing the control that we need because it's been antagonized by the group 4 herbicide, the auxin herbicide. Now, I was at a meeting in December in the Hutchinson area, and one of the growers in attendance asked about Liberty or glyphosate in combination with one of the auxin herbicides. And I probably didn't answer his question very well, but looking at some research from other states, especially on tough weeds like barnyard grass and fall panicum, we can expect to see glyphosate antagonism as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if we'd see some challenges with volunteer corn control if we mix glyphosate in combination with one of the auxin herbicides. The last topic, and Todd, I know I'm down to a couple of minutes. I want to improve or reiterate everybody's awareness to Palmer amaranth, okay? So just a few features of Palmer amaranth. Palmer amaranth grows very fast. It grows 2 to 3 inches a day. And unfortunately, in a week where we might have some wet fields or such, it would be very easy to see Palmer amaranth grow from 2 to 3 inches to 8 to 10 inches in 1 week if we had the right conditions. Number 2, Palmer amaranth makes a lot of seed, okay? And what the challenge there is it's not only going to be next year's problem, but it's going to be a problem for us in a number of years. Number 4, Palmer amaranth robs yield, and it does that by competing with the crop. So you can see the level of yield interference that we've seen from Palmer amaranth in corn and soybeans both. But most importantly, we've lost a lot of herbicides and a lot of herbicide families because of resistance. And this resistance is important with water hemp, but it's even of greater importance for us with Palmer amaranth. So what does it mean in Minnesota? Well, I'll tell you that MDA has done a really good job of trying to manage some of the Palmer amaranth outbreaks that we've had in the various counties. So right now we're managing 5 different outbreaks. So one of them is in Polk County. There's a second one in Clay County. So that's in northwest Minnesota. And then we have 3 different outbreaks in southeastern Minnesota. And those are being actively managed by MDA and University of Minnesota Extension and the producers. Some of the challenges that we've had in west central and southern Minnesota have been addressed. And our data would say that we are not finding any Palmer amaranth in those counties any longer. But the message that I want to leave with everybody today is if you see something that doesn't look right, give me a call. I want you to call me. I don't care what time of the day or night it is. I want to know as soon as possible. And if you can't get a hold of me, contact one of my colleagues in Minnesota Extension or contact Department of Ag directly. So we cannot allow Palmer amaranth to get established in sugar beets. It's a weed that's going to change sugar beet production, unfortunately. So one last slide, or this is my second last slide. Lots of people that I want to acknowledge and thank. Certainly the board for funding our research, and that goes back to your board members, both Mr. Ryberg and Mr. Carlson. We really appreciate the support that you give us. I can't do my work without my cooperators, so thank you very much for trusting me to try to solve technical challenges on your fields. And then finally, Dave, thank you again for the excellent job that you do. And as always, if you have any questions, please call me. I hope I do a good job of getting back, and my contact information is here if you need me. So Todd, I'm out of time. I'll take any comments or questions in chat. Thank you.